Good morning. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies, a think tank here in Washington that examines the impact of immigration on the United States. What we usually do is focus just on U.S. immigration policy, but what we're going to be talking about today is something that's applicable more generally. It is relevant, very relevant to U.S. policy, but also relevant to immigration policy of other migrant receiving countries. And what that is this issue of gatekeeper countries. In other words, the migrants leave, obviously the countries are leaving, and they're going to destination countries like the United States, like Western Europe, Australia, Israel, other places. But there are countries they travel through on the way there, and cooperation with those countries helping to control the flow of migrants and prevent illegal immigration is an essential part of any country's strategy to limit illegal immigration. And so we have three people who are going to be talking about this issue who have thought about it and actually lived it in some cases. And this is an issue that I think in the United States maybe we haven't addressed enough or thought through, certainly in any systematic way, as opposed to Europeans, which have, I think, given it a good deal more thought and applied it more. Our first speaker is Victor Marshai. He's the director of the Migration Research Institute in Budapest and a visiting fellow here at the center. And he's going to talk about the kind of theoretical, conceptual issue of gatekeeper countries and their relationship with the receiving countries. Our second speaker is going to be Nicolette Pénzvaltó. I probably butchered that, so those of you who are Hungarian, pardon me. She's the director of research at the Migration Research Institute in Budapest, and the focus of her research is Turkey, and she's going to be talking about how the Europeans have gotten Turkey's cooperation to try to limit illegal migration through Turkey into Europe. And then finally, last but not least, Christopher Landau, we're honored to have. He's the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Mexico from 2019 to 2021. He is obviously, Mexico was head of the largest diplomatic mission the United States has and dealt with, among many other issues, this issue of how do we cooperate with our neighboring nearby countries to work together to control illegal immigration. After each of them speak, we will have some Q&A. So, Victor, why don't you kick it off?
Thank you very much, Mark. Not only to be here, but the possibility to get CIS, the host institution in Washington, D.C. for more than 5 months. And in general, the topic, I would like to tell that everything you can blame on me because it was my concept and actually my research topic, which is conducted here in the CIS. And just to shift the research question and the hypothesis, the main question for me was in the comparison of the US and the European migration crisis, that in the fiscal year of 2022, more than 2 million illegal border crossing happened in the southwest border of the United States, right? In the last year, 2020, in the European Union external borders, not more than 330,000 illegal border crossing happened. So the difference is almost 8 times. And the question for me was that what's the main reason behind this? Because last year was also, let's say, a tragic year in Europe, a huge increase, almost 70% increase in the number of illegal border crossing, and still the numbers are much lower in the European Union. While we can see that Europe actually has more open borders comparing with the United States, many sea borders, which is easy access. We could see how easily and sometimes in a tragic way the Mediterranean can be passed by illegal border crossers. There's a prolonged crisis since 2013, when actually the first the Kosovonian and across the central Mediterranean route, the Africans started to arrive in a big number to the European Union. And there is a huge crisis in the direct European neighborhood, which actually started with the Arab Spring and COVID-19, some state collapse that happens, for example, in Syria and in Libya, but also the food crisis, which is in Africa is very, very visible, the inflation, economic wars. And it's also important to underline the lack of consensus between certain EU states. And still, as I mentioned, the number are much lower. And according to my understanding and research, which was also supported my stay and the interviews and the research conducted in DC, is definitely the role of gatekeeper countries in this context. A little bit about conceptual framework, which is, of course, very boring for ordinary audience, but for us as researchers, was the most important part of the whole study, that in practice and policy, this gatekeeper issue is very old. In the case of the European Union, but it's almost unknown in migration studies and in the whole academic literature. If you try to Google and try to find articles and theoretical background, you can easily find what is not a gatekeeper issue. It's not the gatekeeper states of Africa, which is a much more political term, nothing about migration. It's not the Operation Gatekeeper, which perhaps sounds more familiar for the American audience because it was conducted by the United States itself, and even not the role of small EU states within the Schengen zone. What is much more gatekeeper issue is somehow a geographic approach. We can make a distinction, of course, between countries of origin, transit countries, and destination countries. Gatekeeper countries are concentrated on transit routes, as Mark mentioned, so somewhere mid between the countries of origin and countries of destination, even if they can serve as countries of origin. There's a thematic approach. Gatekeeper issues definitely the part of migration critique, migration realist approach, which underline the importance of stop or reduction of the flow of irregular arrivals, which is not natural in all aspects of migration studies, to say at least. It's definitely the part of externalization of migration policy, somehow outsourcing of the combat against illegal migration. And in certain extent, it's also the part of the securitization, because of course, once you stop illegal migration, consider that the arrival of a huge mass of people is not only an opportunity, for example, the economy, if it's at all, but also demonstrate challenges and threats for the security, as Todd Bensman, argued, for example, in his books, we can say. Yeah, and it's also policy practice, how EU and the European states and also the United States started to implement policies to in collaboration with third countries to mitigate the flow of illegal migrants. So what we can state that gatekeeper countries are entities which lies on the transit routes towards the transit countries or toward the destination countries or region. They are relatively closed or in most cases in the direct neighborhood of destination countries. And they have some capacities and intention to mitigate the flow of illegal mass migration, because there can be states there, but it's almost impossible, to cooperate them if they don't want. They can be also the countries of origin, as I mentioned, but it's not their main characteristics. But the main question, how they can help to stop the flow of third country citizens. And if we have a look at the certain countries in the context of Europe, they are Turkey, Morocco, Libya, Serbia, or even Niger. This is why we should be very cautious when we state that the gatekeeper countries are in the direct neighborhood of certain states. But in the case of the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, actually the Northern Triangle countries. What are the practical considerations, ladies and gentlemen? It's almost impossible to defend just a thin red line on the map. So border protection, physical border barriers are very important and an integral part of any border protection. But only with fences stopping arrival of hundreds of thousands or million people, it's almost impossible. Another important consideration that if people manage to get in the European Union or the United States, after it, it's almost impossible to somehow relocate them back to third countries or the countries of origin. In the case of EU, it's very evident that independently whether they have any legal background to get any form of protection or refugee status, if you have already in the Schengen zone, you have between 80-85% chance to stay there actually for years, if not forever. Gatekeeper countries can help to outsource long and costly asylum procedures, and it demonstrates a lower expenditure for maintenance. It's easy to realize that maintaining a family in the middle of the United States or in Mexico or in Egypt is much lower, and there are huge differences between them. It's also about the and back to the arriving people. It's the part of the deterrence policy, because if there are significant chance that you will be stopped in a transit countries without reaching your destination countries, you will consider twice whether you are paying thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars and euro to leave your country and try to get in a certain other state. There is higher possibility for return because these countries are much closer, and not only geographically but also in many cases in cultural and social term to their to the countries of origin. So it's also a possibility for return, which, for example, from the United States or the European Union, it's less and less possibility for this. Also, among the practical consideration is that it's a huge toolkit and very wide to collaborate with states, because in this context, states are negotiating with states, not with NGOs, not with other organizations, which sometimes extremely complicated. And from diplomacy across development assistance, trade, and humanitarian assistance, there are many instruments on the table during these negotiations. In general, there are two possible ways and approach for these negotiations. One is the stick and carrot policy, which was very evident in the Migrant Protection Protocols, the remaining Mexico program, offering something and threatening by something. Or it was similar also in the EU-Turkey statement, which is, of course, not the nicer way of politics, but sometimes these are the things how it's going. Which can be more fruitful, perhaps, and there are more and more examples for this, and which can let somehow a win-win situation is an assistance for the gatekeeper countries to stop arrivals and people even before they reach these countries. Austria-Hungary and Serbia just made a tripartite agreement in October to support the defense of the Serbian border patrol, not in the Serbian-Hungarian border, in which case, of course, Belgrade was reluctant because they didn't want to be a parking lot for illegal migrants, but in the North Macedonian-Serbian border, which also interests for Serbia. And we saw similar agreements in 1.5 years between UK and France. But there are also examples from the U.S. Migration policy, for example, in this southern border plan between 2014-15, when the United States provided assistance for Mexico to strengthen border security in its southern border, literally the Mexican-Guatemalan border. How about the implementation? Perhaps it's the most interesting part, and the part where you can debate perhaps most the theory. The EU and the member states has long history and tradition that the outside worlds arrive to Europe. We can mention the Huns, the Germans, Arabs, Hungarians, of course, Mongols, Ottoman, Russians. And we should mention also colonization, which established very strong connection between Europe and the neighboring world. So actually what is definitely on the table, that in the strategic thinking of European policymakers, the cooperation with third countries, gatekeeper countries, even if they don't call them as gatekeeper countries, is always on the table. We can mention different examples. Nicolette will speak about Turkey. But just about the effectiveness of it, currently now, ladies and gentlemen, there are 9 million immigrants in Egypt. And it's 3 million people plus if we compare the numbers before COVID-19 pandemic, which jeopardized a lot of economy, not only in the developed world, but also in the developing world. And still Egypt is ready to cooperate with the European Union and stop these people. In Libya, there are between 600,000 and 1.5 million. And they are not just keeping people there, but for example, the Moroccan Coast Guard is very active to stop people crossing. Just last year, 40,000 people was captured by the Moroccan Coast Guard on the sea, and they were brought back to the shores of Morocco. And if we compare the numbers, ladies and gentlemen, for example, the EU provides $500 million, a little bit more, development assistance to support the migration policy of Morocco. And if we compare that, hundreds of thousands of people for this money are stayed and kept in Morocco, perhaps it's not a very costly deal for us. What about the United States? This is my last slide. It's interesting to see, but in the whole strategic thinking and theoretical thinking of the United States, mass illegal migration is a relatively new challenge because it's emerged in the 80s. So if we compare these decades with the centuries of European Union, it's understandable why in some aspects Europe is much further in the solutions, even if sometimes we don't feel it. The ocean shield concept, and this is my experience in this, is still very strong in the strategic thinking of the United States, and there is limited geopolitical attention towards the south. It's changing in the last 10 years, but still the feeling that, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean provides us a lot of defense, it's still in the mind. And as I mentioned, there are efforts mainly in the last decade to start to collaborate with these third countries. And we can mention also, the root causes issue. We'll see how it works, or the latest Darien agreement. But there's no any systematic consideration who help and support these gatekeeper countries. So a long-term solution and a mid-term solution is needed. Long-term strategies is needed. And both the EU and the United States should focus more on these gatekeeper countries and the win-win solution part of this story. So thank you very much, and finish now.
Thank you, Victor. Nicolette?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity. It's a great honor for me to be here today. As Mark has mentioned, I bring in a European perspective, and I will talk about Turkey as a gatekeeper country. First, I provide you a brief geographical and the recent historical overview. Then I will introduce the March 2016 EU-Turkey statement on migration, and at the end, I will evaluate the deal a bit. So Turkey has a unique geostrategic position, which makes it important for both the United States and Europe for different reasons. As for Europe, Turkey plays a dual role. On the one hand, it is a very important bridge or transit country. It's enough to think of energy policy and the transit of oil and natural gas from the post-Soviet region and the Middle East. And on the other hand, when speaking about different kind of flows, for example, mass irregular migration, the Europe wants Turkey to play the role of a buffer, or more like an insulator state, rather than a bridge. Turkey's geographical location has also contributed to the fact that the country has become the host of the largest number of refugees in the world. According to the data of UNHCR, 3.8 million refugees are residing in Turkey, Most of them, about 3.5 million people, are from Syria. Turkey is a neighboring country of Syria. That's why it is affected so much from the war started in 2011. And the others are mainly from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran. The European Union realized the significance of Turkey as a transit or insulator state in 2015 quite quickly, at the peak of the European migration and refugee crisis. As you can see on the map, in the year of 2015, more than 885,000 irregular migrants arrived from Turkey to the continent via the so-called Eastern Mediterranean migration route. Most of them, about 500,000 people, were from Syria, but there were about 200,000 Afghans and almost 100,000 Iraqi citizens as well. This mass wave of irregular migrants caught Europe completely off guard. It soon became obvious that it was necessary to come to an agreement with Turkey to stop this inflow. This led in March 2016 to the so-called EU-Turkey statement. This 9 points long document was a political statement and not a legally binding treaty. The statement stated that all new irregular migrants crossing from Turkey into Greek island will be returned to Turkey. And Turkey agreed to take any necessary measures to prevent illegal crossings. After the signing of this agreement, the number of irregular arrivals dropped significantly, as you can see it on the slide as well. The blue line is for 2015 and the orange one is for 2016, and it is in a monthly breakdown. What did Turkey get in exchange? Well, money and vague promises. As for the latter, I unfortunately don't have the time to go into details. The remaining points of the statement are about the acceleration of Turkey's visa liberalization roadmap, its EU accession process, a voluntary humanitarian admission scheme that will be activated by the EU, and cooperation in Syria. And let's say that what happened in these regards has not fulfilled Ankara's expectations. But what they have received is the money, 3.3 plus 3 billion euros under the facility for refugees in Turkey. And since then, in 2020, an additional 3 billion euros were allocated for the same humanitarian purposes. It is important to note that assistance provided within the framework of the facility is project-based. So this money does not go directly to the Turkish government. The use of the funds is managed by a steering committee chaired by the European Commission and with the participation of representatives of the member states. Most of the projects are implemented by international NGOs, so the whole process is very transparent, thoroughly planned and monitored. What was this money spent for? You can see several examples. An important background information is that Turkey provides the Syrians under temporary protection free access to education and healthcare. And there are the examples. For example, more than 130 new schools were built, 7.2 million vaccination doses were provided to refugee children, and these are not COVID-19 related vaccination. There is a debate on whether this amount of money is much or not. I would argue that taking everything into account, it is not that much at all. Just to add several more pieces of data, about 45% of Syrians are under 18 years old, and almost about 90% of the working Syrians work in the informal economy, so they don't pay taxes and don't contribute to the state budget this way. Of course, the EU-Turkey agreement was not the sole measure introduced by the EU as a reaction to the migration crisis. In parallel, Greece and several other member states threatened border control. Fences were built all around the continent. that also contributed to the closing of the so-called Balkan migration route. And since 2015, Turkey has also built walls on its eastern borders with Syria and Iran. Is the Turkey bill still working? Would we ask? Well, sort of. Turkey suspended readmissions due to COVID-19 in 2020, and then as a response, Greece designated Turkey as a safe third country for the citizens of, for example, Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, which means that it doesn't accept asylum applications from the citizens of these countries if they are coming through Turkey. However, what is most probably the most important for the EU is that the number of irregular crossings has remained relatively low. In 2020 and 2021, it was about 200,000 irregular crossings, and last year it was a little bit above 42,000. These relatively low numbers can be partly thanks to the EU's financial support that helps Syrians to start a new life in Turkey, which they don't want to risk for the uncertain. And it is also the result of the stricter border control introduced by most of the actors concerned. And of course, it is thanks to the great extent to Turkey's hospitality. Why I emphasize this last one? Because there is a growing dissatisfaction in the Turkish society with the presence of the refugees. We have surveys clearly showing this tendency. The refugee issue has become one of the topics of the ongoing Turkish election campaign as well. The Turkish people don't want to bear this burden alone forever, which is totally understandable, I think. Even more so because Turkey has been struggling with an economic crisis right now. And at some point, this situation may drive the country's leadership to a reckless move, for example, repealing the temporary protection regime. So I think this is something we should definitely watch out for in the future. And to sum up, the EU has outsourced the Syrian refugee crisis to Turkey. From the EU's point of view, the deal has been effective, but it can be criticized from a normative point of view. It is also important to keep in mind that this deal will most probably not last forever. So we should need to think about how we could make the EU-Turkey cooperation on migration sustainable. And at the end, I think, not surprisingly, as Victor also mentioned, a right combination of sticks and carrots are required. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicolette. Chris? Sure. Now we're crossing the Atlantic, coming to our side.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to CIS for inviting me to talk about this important topic. When Mark first asked me to discuss gatekeeper countries, I have to admit I was a little bit hesitant, not because I don't think that it can play a vital role in a comprehensive migration strategy, but because I don't think it is a silver bullet. And I'm always concerned when the United States has an issue, a problem, and tries to outsource it, to use the word that Nicolette just used. I'm firmly of the view that we need to be in control of our own destiny and do what we can within our own borders where we don't have to be asking people for favors. And certainly, I think it's important as part of a comprehensive strategy to try to reduce illegal population flows, which I think are going to be continuing in the 21st century, kind of taking the long view of things as transportation gets easier. But I think, in essence, as long as people can come to the United States illegally and obtain very high-paying jobs and other benefits, those those flows are going to continue. So I certainly think that gatekeeper countries is a piece of the puzzle, but I don't think it should ever be viewed as some kind of silver bullet to solving it. And the same issue kind of goes for drugs, that we kind of, I think a lot of times we have problems in this country. We say, well, really this is Mexico's problem, and Mexico, you need to fix this. I don't think the fact that all these people are entering the United States illegally is Mexico's problem, although Mexico certainly has, a lot to do with it. Just thinking about gatekeepers in particular and Mexico, I think it's an interesting concept because until very recently, I don't think anybody would have thought of Mexico as a gatekeeper on migration issues. Historically, and mass illegal migration, I think, as Victor pointed out, is a relatively recent phenomenon overall. And then for most of the 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, it was overwhelmingly a Mexican issue on our southern border. The people who were coming across were Mexicans, and the system was kind of set up to deal with Mexicans coming into our country. One of the big changes, and I think this really started in the Obama administration with the underage, unaccompanied minors crisis in about 2014, 2015, is that people started coming from all over the world, particularly from the Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Central America, but really from all over. And actually, non-Mexicans, for the first time ever, starting in the last few years, have actually, it varies from month to month, but become a majority of the people crossing our southern border. So all of a sudden, we have a very new migration issue that is not kind of your father's or your mother's migration issue from 30 or 40 years ago. And I don't think we have in place the tools or even really the mindset to deal with that. And I don't think we've come to terms with that. So I think I'd like to focus for a moment on what happened in 2018, 2019, and I think some of the opportunities it opens. Because certainly as ambassador to Mexico starting in 2019, this was the way I looked at the issue to say, one of the reasons I wanted to be ambassador to Mexico is that I thought it was important for the United States to talk to Mexico in the sense of saying, this is a shared problem now. You are no longer just a migrant producing country, but you are a migrant transit country. So all of a sudden, there's a whole new set of issues for you, Mexico, and a lot of common ground for us to work together on issues that you might have seen before as a U.S. versus Mexico issue. There's still a sense in Mexico that it is a migrant-friendly country, and lots of Mexican politicians, even from the party of President López Obrador, still insist there's a human right to migration. I used to say, well, where does that come from? I thought I'm a lawyer. One of the basic characteristics of sovereignty of any country is the ability to control its borders. I may love French culture and identify as a Francophile. That doesn't give me the right to go and live and work in Paris just because I want to. I mean, every country has that is one of the inherent attributes of sovereignty is the right to control who comes into your country. So I said it's important that the discourse in Mexico, which is obviously very sensitive about its own sovereignty issues, include these kinds of dimensions and include the fact that it is not a humanitarian or compassionate approach to be putting policies in place that encourage people to come illegally. I mean, as I think Victor mentioned, this is something that is extremely costly to people. They're often basically entering indentured servitude to put up the money to come to make this journey, which is also a very, very dangerous journey in which many people are killed. So it's interesting just to focus on, I think, the U.S. Mexico migration crisis of 2018, 2019 as kind of an example of what can be done. So President López Obrador was elected in 2018, came into office on December 1st of that year, and from a left-wing party, new party in Mexico, and some of the elements of that party were very much trying to set a different note than the United States, and said, our Central American brothers and sisters, you're welcome in Mexico, and we will embrace you with open arms. And so what happened? Caravans started forming, mass migration. Even though Trump was still in the United States, you started to see mass migration from Central America, into Mexico. But did they stop in Mexico? No, of course not. They had no intention of just going to Mexico. They used Mexico as a transit point to go to the United States. And so I think President López Obrador then kind of had egg on his face because his kind of open border policy towards the Central American brothers and sisters was obviously just a something that a mechanism that made it easier for people to get into the United States. This is one of the points I make when people say, oh, we got to address root causes. The root causes in Central America didn't change one bit before and after this migration flow. There was no hurricane, there was no coup, there was no, crackdown along ethnic or religious or political lines. It was simply a change in migration policy, in that case by Mexico. And I said, look, what really drives this fundamentally is just like any other human decision. People are economically rational, and they make a choice. How much are they going to have to spend, and what are their odds of getting into Mexico, across Mexico, and into the United States, and successfully getting in there? They're always making that determination. And so I think President López Obrador's strategy in 2018 unleashed this crisis, and President Trump then announced in May of 2019, when we were starting to get 140,000 people a month at the border. Crossing, attempting to cross illegally. He said, look, enough is enough. And he, basically said he's going to impose these tariffs on Mexico. And it's interesting, every single one of my predecessors as ambassador to Mexico signed a letter saying, oh my gosh, you can't do this. We never mix migration and commercial issues, which I thought, where does that come from? I mean, since when do you not use leverage that you have in a bilateral relationship? Mexico uses migration leverage all the time with us. It just seems ridiculous that we had kind of compartmentalized these various issues in our relationship with Mexico. Anyway, be that as it may, President Trump did that, and before he knew it, the Mexicans had sent a delegation to Washington, and we worked out an agreement with them. That meant Mexico was actually, really for the first time in its history, going to take a more active role in controlling these migrant flows. Again, I think that corresponded to public opinion in Mexico, that the Mexicans were not happy either that their country was getting used as a doormat by people from China, India, Bangladesh, Kazakhstan, Congo, Cuba, you name it. It's like the United Nations down there on the border. I think there is lots of opportunities to work with Mexico. One of the things that was put into place, in late 2018, early 2019, was the Remain in Mexico policy. And basically, that was a reflection of the fact that our asylum system is broken. Our asylum system, as you know, is kind of a carve-out to our normal migration rules. We have normal rules about how you can migrate legally and illegally. And then we kind of created this safe harbor for people who were fleeing a fear, a reasonable, well-founded fear of imminent death if they were on the basis of certain characteristics if they remain in their countries. Well, obviously that system was getting abused by people who were just economic migrants, but who knew what buzzwords to say so that they would get processed into the American asylum system. If enough people do that at once, you don't get a hearing for 4 years then. And then you were being allowed into the United States, which obviously was a huge kind of loophole to our entire immigration mechanism and was really incentivizing a lot of these flows. So Mexico agreed to a system where those people, instead of being allowed into the United States to wait for their asylum hearing, were required to remain in Mexico. What that did almost overnight is it dried up those flows. And so I think Mexicans had been somewhat concerned that they would be stuck with this huge migrant population. Those fears really didn't materialize because once people knew this, again, their economically rational cost-benefit analysis changed. And I think in this sense, Mexico may be somewhat different than Turkey and Syria, because Syria really was, again, I don't purport to know a lot about the Syrian conflict, but at least initially, there was a very brutal war going on in Syria. So some of the people might have actually fled for those reasons. There's no similar issue in Central America. So anyway, this is certainly a change. Once the Biden administration came in and basically indicated that it had no interest in limiting illegal migration, as far as I can tell, the Mexicans have basically given up as well. I think their thought is, hey, we're not going to be more Catholic than the Pope. If you guys don't care about this, why should we? And so that's pretty much where we are right now. I've always been a little bit surprised that Remain in Mexico became the outcome, because Remain in Mexico to me is a kind of second best approach where these people are in the U.S. asylum system, and so they're, just waiting in Mexico for their time to come up. It would seem to me that if you just think about asylum in terms of what it's supposed to be doing, it's supposed to be shelter you give somebody who's immediately fleeing for their lives. I mean, I think this came up in what Victor and Nicolette were saying, that it seems odd for people to cross third countries where they don't have those imminent threats of danger and then apply for asylum in their preferred country. That seems to be more of a traditional immigration issue, not an asylum issue, which is just give me immediate shelter from the immediate risk I'm facing. Anyway, for whatever reason, in Mexico, the idea of safe third country just became political poison. They would not accept that under any circumstances, even though I thought, in a sense, that is more respectful of their sovereignty to say, look, you guys, you can't, for our domestic purposes, we regard Mexico as a safe third country, and that disentitles you to apply for asylum if you cross Mexico and come here. I think that's a cleaner way than remain in Mexico. But be that as it may, remain in Mexico served a very useful purpose, and I think the Mexicans could see that as well. So I do think that there is a lot to be said for exploring gatekeepers more as part of our migration policy. One thing I was saying to Mark just before this started, and this will be my final observation, is that it is important, I think, to recognize that Mexico can play a gatekeeping role, but it shouldn't all be on Mexico. A lot of people are flying in from Europe to countries like Ecuador or Brazil that have much looser visa requirements and then making their way over land through 6 or 7 countries, Colombia, Panama. I mean, there's a very narrow, funnel for them to go through. The idea that we kind of wait until they arrive in Mexico, where we have a 2,000-mile border, to really get serious about stopping these flows seems to me ridiculous. I think this should be the number one issue in our relationship with Panama, with Costa Rica, with Nicaragua. What can they do? I mean, there's so many potential places there where these flows can be stopped and discouraged. So anyway, I think it's something certainly worth considering, but I think it is a mistake to think that this is the magic bullet that will solve the crisis from our point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And actually, I wanted to, before we take questions or maybe reactions from the rest of the panel, I think the point you made is important, that relationships with gatekeeper countries, transit countries, is a complement to our own efforts to control illegal immigration, not a substitute. And I think under the Trump administration, it was approached as a complement. In other words, the administration domestically was doing what it could to limit illegal immigration, and then asked Mexico to, and to some degree the Northern Triangle countries, to help out, basically to row in the same direction.
Correct.
And what I think the Biden administration has done for 2 years is say, domestically, we're not going to do anything to limit illegal immigration, but we expect you, Mexico, to stop it for us.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing on energy. They're stopping domestic energy production and going around the world asking Saudi Arabia and Venezuela to pump more oil.
Right.
I mean, it's a very similar dynamic.
So, we'll take questions. I have a whole list of questions myself, and I did pay for the microphone. But nonetheless, I'll see if anybody has questions. Jessica?
Thank you. Thank you all for your insight and analysis. Really very interesting. I have a question for Victor. Being a gatekeeper country does also seem to provide some opportunity for what you might call blackmail. Can you comment a little bit on how you think that can be dealt with?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Collecting question. Okay, yeah. Of course, and they are doing this. It's Turkey is doing this when they opened the border just before the COVID-19 pandemic, February 2020. But also Morocco did it when it was 8,000 illegal migrants to cross within half an hour to the Spanish enclave. So it's definitely there. So. And we should mention another, I didn't want to mention too much definition, but another term, the stabilocracies, which are stabilocracies. It's a new term in the literature which describe stable countries. Stable, that's the first one. stabilo-cracies or autocracies, authoritarian regimes, which, keeping this. And, it's constant blame that which are the countries that the European Union is supporting as the gatekeepers in the Assisi government or the Erdogan government, whether we are sacrificing our democratic values and norms supporting this kind of regime. So it's definitely on the table. This is why I suggest that shifting from this carrot and stick policy, which has its certain limits. We could see in the change in the administration in the White House, then suddenly Mexico realized that some states didn't want to maintain the Remain Mexico anymore for family units, etc., etc. So it's always complicating and a very, very quickly changing situation. So to shifting from this to this, let's say, win-win situation, because Mexico, as I mentioned, and Mexican people don't want the country become a parking lot. And reacting to the excellencies are, let's say, critics and ideas. When we visited the U.S sector at the end of March with the border tour, they mentioned that I think 130 different citizens were there.
Different countries.
From different countries, yeah, sorry. And I think it's also the part of the gatekeeper story that with how many states can you make a deal? In how many countries can you try to handle the root causes? And just you mentioned Ecuador, Nicaragua, other countries. If you make a deal with Ecuador, perhaps then the pattern will shift. I don't know to the people going to Brazil or Colombia, etc., etc. So actually, the gatekeeper issue is also about the story to make negotiation and the deal not with dozens of different countries, but 1, 2, 3 maximum. And in this context, I think the United States is an excellent position, ladies and gentlemen, because Mexico is the gatekeeper country. In the case of the European Union, it's much more complicated. We are surrounding dozens of different countries, and they're utilizing their potential. We could see in 21 in the Belarusian crisis when they weaponized migration. So this is, I think also a strong point of the argumentation that in this context, you have to concentrate on one country, and you can offer a solution for these countries, not the remain of Mexico, because as Excellence mentioned, it's a burden for Mexico. But for example, providing protection for the if there is openness, of course, from Mexico City for the protection of the southern border of Mexico, perhaps it can be a much easier story.
There's a question back there.
Yes, this is for Nicolette. You mentioned the financial aid that Turkey receives for the refugee program, and I know you had mentioned help from the EU. Are there any other entities that are assisting with the refugee program, or that have assisted with the refugee program in Turkey?
Of course, there are a lot of different actors, so international organizations and countries outside of the EU. So there are a lot of countries and organizations supporting refugees in Turkey. But I think the EU is the biggest donor in this sense. So this more than 9 billion euros, I think it's the biggest contribution.
I think actually that's an interesting point, because the UN, for instance, and we've written about some of this with regard to the flow coming north into the toward the U.S. border, the UN actually facilitates the flow of illegal migration to the United States. I mean, they're giving out, money to illegal immigrants. They're funding, we've written about this, it's on our site at CIS.org. They're funding psychological assistance where third country migrants, Central America mostly, apply for asylum in Mexico as a kind of temporary expedient. They get rejected. Then they go and visit these psychiatrists or psychologists, and then they do recovered memory therapy where they realize, no, really, they were persecuted. They just forgot about it. And then they go and go back. And this is all UN funded. We were just, as Victor mentioned, we were on a border tour We went from San Diego to Yuma and back, and we visited Mexicali. We were there for a day, visited several migrant shelters, which are themselves funded by various UN-affiliated organizations. So to your question, it's not, I mean, sure, there's a role, it seems to me, for multinational or supranational organizations to assist migrant flow, but for the most part, it certainly ideologically and even just as a practical matter, what they're doing is actually facilitating or accelerating the flow, not interfering with it. Was there another question? Yeah.
Well, I have a question concerning the different domestic dynamic within the United States versus Europe. I mean, in some sense, we know in the United States who it is who takes a dim view of immigration enforcement and thus doesn't want to pressure third countries. You know, it's much of the Democratic Party, the business interests in the United States, and so forth. And so it seems to me that that's the fundamental question for the United States. We could get the cooperation of these countries, but we'd have to push them. And at present, this regime and the coalition it represents has very little interest in actually threatening trade or foreign aid and things like that. But what I don't have a sense is, in Europe, what is it? What is the domestic? Is there a domestic constituency of people, maybe not in Hungary, but in the rest of the EU, who feel like, look, it doesn't really matter if 1 million people come illegally here. We need workers. We're, an aging population, or they see them as just humanitarian migrants. So does the Europe seems to be able to not have a fundamental flip in policy. So Trump saw it as a priority. Biden sees it as not important at all to enforce the law. And so, but in Europe, it seems like, I'm kind of curious. I just don't understand. What are the interest groups that would play out here a little bit? Can you give us some more? I just don't know, and I'd like to know.
Okay, thank you for the question, Steve. I think the fundamental difference between the whole concept of immigration between the United States and the European Union, that actually since the beginning, as I know, the immigration to the United States was actually a labor issue. So these people arrived and they started to climbing in the hiring lane, slowly. And still now it's more or less the case. And of course, there are many aspects of the story that Roy Beck wrote on the how it affects the Afro-American population, the job potential, etc. But it's my impression is it's not a question that if you are arriving to the United States, as soon as possible, you have to find something some place to work. In the European Union and in Europe in general, I think there was a huge shift in the late 80s, early 90s, when by the 60s, 70s, it was also a labor issue. In the 90s, it shifted to a humanitarian issue. Letting people from civil war areas, persecuted people, escaping from genocide. And the main focus was a humanitarian focus, which meant that we have to provide them shelter, education, food, etc. And the whole story of labor force participation, integration into labor market, it was a secondary or third in this context. And I think we made a huge mistake in this story because, in Europe, it's still a big challenge. You arrive, you apply for asylum, the time also years while you get a final decision. And in most cases, you don't have the right to work, which is completely other story what's going in the United States, mainly after the Trump decision that even you are let's say, illegal immigrant and waiting what will be your story, you get the working permission here. So actually, what's the consequence of this policy? That there are huge communities in all around of Europe, mainly Western Europe, who are on the social benefits, even they don't have the possibility to work, even if they want, because there's no work authorization for them. And, you know, in the 90s and early 20s, it seems that it's okay, some thousands and tens of thousands, it's okay. But now it's hundreds of thousands of people, generation of new kids alienated from the European societies. And there's no real possibility or idea how to drive them back to the labor market. They, as we discussed, they're out of the labor market. And who's arrived now? There's no real expectation that they are going to work. It was the big idea in 2015 that, 1 million people arrived to Germany. They will solve all problems. But these people are not coming, you know, to Guatemala, Honduras, you know, have the family connection, places where they know if I go there, I will get some job, illegal or great job, but I will get. Syrians arrive, no connections, no any idea how, don't speak the language, very, very different culture. And still now half of the people who arrived in 2015 out of the labor market. So it means, and you know, after 8 years, the chances, you know, it's very, very limited.
I had a question regarding that sort of expands on the gatekeeper country idea, and I'd like to hear people's reactions. Denmark, if you followed this, did something that they don't call it, but I call it remain in Rwanda. So that if you come in there, they would literally send you to Rwanda. And the difference was you weren't applying for asylum in Denmark, but waiting in Rwanda. They sent you to Rwanda and you could apply for asylum in Rwanda. And the Australians tried the same kind of thing where they put people on several islands of other countries and said, you're not getting to Australia. Cambodia's agreed to take your asylum requests. That's a sort of different, I mean, that's part of sort of a gatekeeper approach, but one that doesn't have the limitations that you would refer to, Chris, in Remain in Mexico, but presumably a little harder to twist the arms of a country to agree to do that because, you know, then you actually are sending people there to those countries. Any thoughts on this, you know, the Danish approach and the Australian approach in this regard? Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, and then again, me, sorry. You know, ladies and gentlemen, because, you know, I'm Africanist, so I a little bit know about the background, and not only the Danish deal, but also the UK Rwanda deal. Ladies and gentlemen, again, if you have the possibility that paying 10,000 euro or dollar for a very risky trip to reach Europe, and you have the possibility that you will be sent back or sent to Rwanda, because most people's land is Rwanda, you know, you will consider it not twice, but 3 or 4 times whether you invest this huge chunk of money for the journey. And the second issue, ladies and gentlemen, also just to know the internal dynamic of African politics. You know, if a European capital calling, I don't know, Abuja, that, okay, there is 20,000 Nigerians arrived illegally, there's no right to stay, please accept them back. Abuja said, oh no, how you can prove that they are Nigerian, there's no passports, oh no, actually the weather is very bad, Abuja, so deportation flights can come, so no. But if Paul Kagame, who is the leading personality, even is a very controversial personality in African politics, if he raises phone and, come on, I will send back 10,000 of your fellow citizens, okay, just send it, okay. Sorry to say, but it's how politics is working in Africa. It's very important. The big problem with the deal is, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the progressive development of EU law and whole European law, that it's definitely illegal, we should say it. Because according the European refugee and asylum law, which much more progressive than the Geneva Convention, which was implemented of course the EU corpus but was extended, each person has the right to apply asylum in the territory of the certain states if he reached it or she reached it. This is why Hungary also under the court of the European Union, because there's currently no possibility to apply asylum in the territory of Hungary, only in the consulate of Belgrade. So, and this is the problem. Even the British Minister of Interior confessed that yes, likely it's against international law to make these, to outsource this refugee, asylum procedure to Rwanda. Even if it's very funny, that last sentence, that the regulation and the agreement was attacked that Rwanda is not a safe third country and the asylum system is weak, blah blah blah. Why the United Nations, the UNHCR, has an agreement with Rwanda, bringing people from Libyan detention centers to Rwanda. And I understand that UK and Libya is very different. But if Rwanda is considered that the refugee system is underdeveloped and the country is not safe, that how is possible that people coming from Libya, for them is enough safe, coming from UK is not enough safe? So, no.
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute the question. I mean, Chris had pointed out that, why should you even be, anyone passing through Mexico be allowed to apply for asylum? The fact is the law allows it, and the law, prevents in Europe sending people to Rwanda. The question is, would the policy work? And it seems to me, and that relates to the question of aid and money, because a lot of countries, I mean, let's face it, they're run by one person or a small elite. If you bribe the right person, then you can get a country to agree. I mean, just to pick an example, and I have no idea how Cambodia is run, but if you deposit $50 million into the right person's Swiss bank account, the country will become much more cooperative. And it seems to me, this is real politic, and we need to stop pussyfooting around. So we'll take one last question from the back.
Yeah, excellent panel. We get a context on the European Union's Remain in Turkey policy and how it is actually heavily financed by European powers, the EU. But as Nicola mentioned, nevertheless, there is growing resentment in Turkey to this policy that keeps these people in the country, and with all the disruption that inevitably comes with that. And then Ambassador Landau gave us great insights on Mexico, and my question really goes to Mexico. It would seem that the very fact that the White House policy, the administration's policy, allures hundreds of thousands of people into Mexico, already embattled with criminal cartels and other sorts of serious challenges, sovereignty challenges. The Mexicans are very famous for defending their sovereignty vis-a-vis Washington. They seem to complain not at all publicly. López Obrador, in the policy discussions, the so-called security discussions between Washington and Mexico, they're not asking for money that I've read about. They're not even complaining about Mayorkas's policies that have deposited hundreds of thousands of people from outside the continent in their country. Why is that? What should Americans understand about what's going on in Mexico that brings about such a lay-down policy?
That's a great question, and certainly it was, I think it just kind of goes back to the cultural roots of migration in Mexico, that I think Mexico still has a pretty strong self-image as a source of migrants, and I don't think they have kind of come around to a way of thinking for the 21st century that their role now is much more likely to be as a transit point for migrants. And I think that was one of my challenges as ambassador, to kind of say to Mexico, please, you have to update your thinking in a sense that this is a huge challenge to your own sovereignty. We saw that during COVID when, control over your borders became something that everybody was doing. Mexico was one of the only countries in the world that even at the height of the pandemic never did any flights from anywhere in the world. New York City, Milan, when those cities were really in the midst of the pandemic, there is still something in Mexican way of thinking about these issues that is kind of reflexively pro-migrant, open borders. Again, I think that will change. I think that's more maybe the Mexican political elite is still somewhat behind public sentiment. I think it is just hard for Mexico. It's like having cognitive dissonance or an out-of-body experience. Why should we care more about illegal migration than the United States? I just think they haven't wrapped their heads around that. But I think they should, because whatever our policies are, the impact on Mexico is going to be dramatic. And so, I think if we have an open borders policy that's enticing and luring in migrants from all over the world to come through Mexico, you would think Mexico would be concerned about it. So I agree with your question. It is somewhat surprising. I think I think that will change. And I think it's important for the United States to engage Mexico on these issues.
And I think it's interesting that Mexico does seem to have a similar disconnect between its leadership class and its public view on immigration as we have here, because when the flow of Central Americans got pretty significant, remember this was a number of years ago, there was actually a protest in Tijuana against all these Central Americans who were coming through. And the mayor at that time, who was politically kind of embattled, saw this as an opportunity, printed up a red baseball cap that said, "Make Tijuana Great Again," and went to the protest against the Mexican popular protest against the flow of Central Americans through Tijuana.
I think the one thing is, and this kind of maybe answers your question, I think for Mexico, they see the answer to this not as necessarily protesting all the people coming into their country, but just shipping them off to the United States as quickly as possible. And so in a sense, I think that is the safety valve now, that they don't have to worry about massive, about like what the Turkey situation is. I think as long as the United States is willing to receive them, in a sense, that's the easiest out for Mexico, just to immediately facilitate the transportation to the border and kind of make it our problem.
Well, thank you for everybody on the panel. Something I probably should have said at the beginning, but it kind of occurred to me as we were talking. In the American context, when we talk about Gatekeeper, we think of Operation Gatekeeper, which was in the 1990s a major Border Patrol initiative in the San Diego area to actually stop illegal immigrants from crossing, which is a radical idea, apparently. The interesting point, though, is that that term, Operation Gatekeeper, assumed that the Border Patrol was sort of the first resort in stopping people from getting across, whereas the whole theme of our discussion here of gatekeeper countries is in a sense that the Border Patrol should be the last resort, and that the point is to reduce, in a sense, sort of through attrition, reduce the number of people who actually get to the Border Patrol by cooperating agreements with foreign countries and changing the sort of the calculation of incentives and payoffs, because as Victor said, you're not going to pay tens of thousands of dollars and take all of this risk just to end up in Rwanda. And so I think that it is in the U.S. Discussion of this, we need to stop thinking of the Border Patrol agent as the first resort in stopping illegal immigration, and rather think of him or her as the last resort, sort of the final person. After we've done everything else, that amount of illegal immigration that, despite all of that, has still come through, then the Border Patrol agent's job comes into
I agree with that. And
play.
I think I might disagree with Victor a little bit on this point, that I think even looking to Mexico as the gatekeeper, I think is problematic, because if somebody's already in Mexico, we have a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. Right. I think we need to think about, and we also have a very complicated relationship with Mexico that involves security issues, economic issues. There's a lot on the table. I think countries like Costa Rica, Panama, I think it's a much simpler thing to say that's where we got to really stop them. The weight should not always be only on Mexico.
Right. And as Victor said, in referencing Niger, it doesn't have to be countries right next door, even for Europeans. Right. Okay, well, I'm going to respect people's time. Thank you, Victor and Nicolette and Chris, for coming in. This video will be on our website, cis.org. We're also going to have the PowerPoints that we saw. And I welcome all of you to tune in or come in person even to future events. We do these kind of things pretty frequently. Thanks for tuning in or showing up in person, and hope you come in next time.